The long boom was a concept that myself and my co-author Peter Schwartz came up with in the mid-90s. We actually really wrote the original cover piece in Wired in 1996 and wrote a book that went into 6 different languages by the late 90s. The concept there was that essentially we were in a long wave economic expansion that periodically in world history you see them as long booms is kind of just a phrase that they think, which means it's not about, they're about fundamental economic expansions. In our case, we were talking about the fundamentally new technologies of computers and the interconnected internet, which in the mid-90s, again, was just, we were just wrapping our heads around the implications of that. We were talking about the fundamentally new thing of the globalization and the global economy, the integration of all these national economies in ways and how that would spur growth. And not just how information technologies were going to spur growth, but also another bunch of waves of technologies, biotechnologies, clean technologies, and ultimately nanotechnologies. So the fundamentals of that economy were going to spur growth, not just in America, but all throughout the world. The fundamental story of that is true. We have watched this global boom in the broadest sense with China, India, all these other countries getting more and more integrated in the global economy, driving more and more growth. We're watched uninterrupted almost, with very few pauses, the dissemination of these technologies, everyone grabbing computers going to all devices, everything getting reconnected, broadband coming, going wireless. I mean, all these kind of through-line trends we're talking about are basically played out. So in many respects, the long boom is happening. We're about halfway through this long boom, if not a little bit more. Now that doesn't mean historically long booms do have, are constantly interrupted, or not constantly, but have frequent recessions. They have frequent kind of bubbles in stock markets, but that does not destroy the recession, or in fact these ups and downs of financial bubbles does not destroy the fundamental thing going on, which is at the core of the economy. What's driving fundamental growth is more a fundamental technology change and also fundamental integration of the global economy. Those things are going uninterrupted. So this current recession, though, I would say is a deep and profound kind of shift. I think this is a little bit different than what we would have talked about in the long boom. The long boom, we were more saying there are going to be these shorter recessions that we've seen. But this thing is different. I think this thing is really more a cusp between eras shift, and I think, if anything, I think coming out of this we're going to see some kind of acceleration into a 21st century economy. One way to think about this crisis is to not minimize it, but to actually say this is something really kind of different going on here, and to really kind of schematize it. I think we've kind of watched in the last year a pretty fundamental breakdown of 20th century systems that I would say for the last 25 years in the United States, and for that matter I think in the Western world and globally, we essentially were maintaining a kind of a free market, late 20th century kind of framework of how the economy worked. In political terms, it was kind of an era of conservative politics in the United States where we were essentially hanging on to the old system and squeezing the juice out of it to the very end. I think what we saw with the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the collapse of GM and the collapse of, in our case, in our country, collapse of media companies that are going, newspapers collapsing all around us, I think we're watching a pretty fundamental collapse of, or certainly serious disruption of that 20th century systems of media, of economics, of banking, of automobiles, of giant corporations, the kind of things that kind of were defined that 20th century. At the same time, we're watching this new system starting to kind of emerge out of this. And so I think we're going to basically see this crisis as essentially the breakdown of the old system and the beginning of the new. And that new kind of system, in a very transformational way, I think is going to have several key components to it. I think we're watching a fundamental shift now. It would be from a more nationally organized economies into a global economy. I think all our systems are now going global, and I think we're going to see out of this with time that this crisis started to really reintegrate global economies on a really much more highly, officially kind of integrated way. I think we're watching a shift now. The world is, I think, finally going to start taking seriously letting go or getting off of the carbon-based energy systems of the 20th century, and I think we're really going to watch in a really aggressive way the shifting to the kind of clean technologies of the 21st century. I think we're also seeing a kind of a shifting away from unsustainable kind of ways of 20th century capitalism of excess products and waste and bottles and landfills filling up and all the things that we realized weren't working, a more sustainable way that with time we'll understand much clearer in the 21st century. And ultimately I think we're at the cusp between, let's say, 20th century systems and living into 21st century systems and living. And even though we're 10 years or close to 10 years into the 21st century, I think we're going to see historically that this is really the cusp between the two centuries. And I think this crisis kind of accentuated that. It showed the old system was seriously not working, and it started to birth the new system. And so I think with time, that's the perspective we should bring to this, that we really are in the midst of a beginning of a real transformation. I think it's going to be 10 or 20 years of rapid innovation across many different spaces, many different industries, and ultimately I think it's going to be a very different world in about 20, 25 years from now. I do think the 21st century and this next era is going to definitely be market-based, and it's going to, it's still fundamentally a capitalist system. But I do think that there is a sense of less virulent kind of competition and less kind of highly individualistic behavior of driving things, and I think a less of the hard edges of that kind of market-based, kind of greed-oriented kind of growth that we watched in the last few decades. I think you're going to see much less of that. I also think that what we're going to find that is the common problems that the world faces in the broadest sense, but also the common problems that even companies are going to face within industries. I think at all levels we're realizing that we need to cooperate more, and there's a lot more kind of coordination and collaboration that has to happen to wrap our heads around solving any of these challenges. So just for example, I mean, all the major problems that the world faces essentially now are really global in nature. And climate change, which is the mother of all challenges, you could say, is going to be the thing that's going to define our lives the next 50 years, is also, totally global in nature. It's amazingly complex, and that no one country, let alone one company, is going to be able to even begin to wrap their heads around this in any kind of serious way. So the only way forward, the only way we're going to solve that kind of level of complex global problems is through much higher levels of collaboration. Now, lucky for us, meaning us in the world, this same incredible challenge coincides with an amazing wave of very powerful collaborative tools. And that finally we can, from an historical point of view, is we're able to take advantage of the incredible power of the computerization of everything and this incredible interconnection through telecommunications, the internet, and all the other things. Those two twin fundamental technologies, which we got to remind ourselves didn't even exist in any kind of practical way 20 years ago, now gives us incredibly powerful tools. And on top of that, besides those fundamental shifts in technology, we actually have a level of specifically very powerful collaborative tools that are starting to come online even just within the last year here or so. And those tools are going to allow us to problem solve at some level by involving many, many, many more people in kind of conversations, discussions, and projects that essentially solve this thing in a way that we never were before. Again, in short, the way to think of it is in the 20th century, problems got solved by very centralized, very small groups of people, whether it's in government or in elite business kind of boardrooms. I think in the 21st we're going to see, often through these new kind of collaborative tools, not just 100 or hundreds of people, but maybe thousands, and if not ultimately even millions of people getting involved in helping solve these very complex, very challenging problems. Whether it's public challenges like climate change or frankly private challenges like a company trying to figure out how the heck are we going to basically just survive. Those kinds of inputs from many, many, many more people, those kind of, is going to be rooted in these new collaborative tools. Some of the metaphors that I'd be thinking about is the system that we came out of, the 20th century system, particularly the late 20th century system that even kept us going for the last years into this century, was essentially the individual. It was a very individualistic kind of system. It was very much rooted in individuals. And I think if you think of, so as that the kind of metaphor at the core of it, I think this is going to be much more group-oriented kind of century, and in many, many ways there's implications of that metaphor from individual to group. And I think what's really happening is you're going to, we mentioned a little bit of how this is going to be a much more collaborative century. It's going to be one where people really have to work together at great scale, again, around a group. It's not going to be solved by some brilliant, one crazy, insight genius, which is what the 20th century was all built around. Individuals, geniuses, stand-up personalities, stars, all this kind of stuff was kind of a lot of the metaphors of the 20th century. I think this is going to be much more different. Like, who's the star of YouTube, as opposed to the star of broadcast television in the 60s, we had stars in YouTube or the star of, Facebook. There's no concept. It's a group thing. It's connecting large numbers of people that don't stand out. And I think that's a kind of a good metaphor for a lot of the stuff that, I think we're going to go into. The same thing is, who were the great nations of the 20th century? You stand out America and some of the European powers, that kind of thing. I think the 20th century is just going to be this seamless global thing in a very important way. There'll still be, national identities at some level. Much less so, though. Again, it's a group. It's how the world works together. It's interconnecting people and things. It's not the kind of all about one superpower. It's about all interconnected people are the globe. So I think group today, or we're going from a kind of much more individualized set of metaphors, which also involves centralization, who has the power, who's in the middle, who's in control. Those are all kind of, individualized metaphors. I think the 21st is going to be much more group-oriented metaphors, which is how do teams work, how do we collaborate, who's connected, how do you, aggregate more, how do we all kind of come to a whole. It's a much more holistic way of thinking as opposed to individualized. There's a lot of kind of ways you can play with those metaphors. I think where you really, the more structural things that drive innovation are essentially based on new tools. Of course ideas have to come out of the brains of human beings and stuff, but I think when you really see breakthrough new insights, they usually, on a fundamental structural level, come about through new tools. So for example, it wasn't just, that you had some individual scientist that just came up with the idea of, a breakthrough of cells. It's like you had a tool of a microscope that allowed you to kind of see down in deeper and deeper into the cell structure, and you realize, oh my God, that's what's happened. Or it wasn't that, somebody just lied in the field, 500 years ago said, my God, there's all these stars. Stars aren't galaxies, they aren't just stars, they're galaxies. It was a telescope that allowed you to go deeper in there, and you finally saw, oh my God, there's galaxies out there, not stars. I think it's the same thing. So just like we have breakthroughs in science because of the tools, I think in terms of innovation, we're essentially get breakthroughs because of new tools that allow you to do new things in new ways. And stimulates the thinking in new ways, but it opens up new challenges of thinking. And I think in that respect, we're on the cusp of a great wave of innovation. And I think it's because we're finally understanding how to productively harness these extremely powerful tools of computerized everything with chips, digital chips and everything, and these interconnections across all things. Now, we talk about briefly how that's a big thing. People get the internet and get the kind of computer chips are a big thing. But just think of it in the kind of the practical way. So like what if you basically had gone in the middle of the 20th century when the world was struggling with the Great Depression and the rise of World War II and all these problems, which the United States led by Franklin Roosevelt and those kind of folks, or Churchill here in England and different characters in Europe. What if you had told them, you said, hey, we got a device that you can basically, we'll give you a little device with a screen, and you can basically ask any question in the world, get back all the interconnected information of the world in 1 second. They would just look at you like, well, that's complete magic. There's like no way you could even do that. And in fact, we call it Google, and it's now done over any iPhone or whatever you want to do. The power of that tool, interconnecting all the world's information and in a second basically bringing it back, is we forget how absolutely mind-bogglingly powerful that is. even just from even 10 or 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And so in a world historical context, that kind of tool breakthrough is going to lead to some incredibly wild things and wild innovation, and that's what we're starting to see. And just like that's the case, that's just one informational way, connecting information. If you get breakthrough tools that allow not just 100 people to work together in a room, which is kind of the maximum human beings have been able to do for the last, millennia or two. If you can allow 10,000 or 10 million people to work productively together on a tool, that's a breakthrough that is going to lead to some crazy innovation out of that, because you'll harness the thinking of 10,000 or 10 million brains as opposed to those 100 brains. I mean, that's the kind of structural change through the use of new tools that will allow breakthrough innovation in a way that is really the key. So I'm a tool-based guy, but luckily for us, we've got the most amazing tools of all times that have just come online. In the historical sense, just come online. It's like, think about this. 15 years ago, most people didn't know what email was or the World Wide Web. And now, like we know, it's just woven into our lives. That kind of change is a historical blink of an eye, and I don't think we've even begun to see the implications of that blink. Basically, we're just starting to figure it out now. Basically, what we're in the midst of is essentially a great transformation of the world, as I was kind of mentioning, from the 20th to 21st. Another way to think of it is a kind of a series of paradigm shifts from the old paradigms of different mediums to new media, or different shifts from kind of different old way of doing politics to new ways of doing politics, which is kind of what I was talking about. But and there's a bunch of ways in business now we're seeing shifts from the old ways of making decisions to eventually these new ways that you're going to involve much more people. And all these are paradigm shifts, and the one common thread between these shifts is essentially the next paradigm that we're moving into all involves much more engagement of people well beyond the core group, whether it's the core executive group in a company, or the core group in a political party, or running a government, or it's the core group of a media company that thinks it's creating content for people. All the kind of next systems essentially involve a two-way interactive engagement of whether it's more your employees or your customers or your public at large. It's essentially a very different thing. Now the tools, the next wave of tools that we're already getting used to, social networking and commenting on blogs, and they're all starting to be much more engaged anyhow. But again, I think we're just seeing the beginnings of this. We're going to watch much more involvement back and forth with collaborative tools that enrich a much more complex and nuanced way that we're going to be able to interact with large numbers of people outside your organization or within your organization if you have a big organization. But what I'm saying is the meta theme that's in that is engagement. Those organizations, you could say, that kind of stay with the old paradigm, that 20th century paradigm, which is I make a decision, or people, a tight group of people around me make a decision, occasionally an expert or something we borrow from outside our organization, but we make decisions. And then what we do is just explain the decision, or tell the new policy, or give the new product to the world, and push it out in a kind of broadcast way to everybody else. Just takes our word for it. This is what we're doing. That thing is going out, not just out of style, but that is going to be extremely problematic for people that kind of hang on to that paradigm. I think what you're going to have to do in the future here is you're going to have to engage right from the beginning. You're going to have to engage people to get input into your decisions, whether it's people in your employees in your organization to get much more feedback, whether it's customers in your organization that buy your product, or whether it's the public who perceives your company from a long time. All these kind of methods of engaging these different constituencies, these different kind of stakeholders, and getting more input into your decision making is going to be critical. But also, once you make decisions, once you create products, once you start to move down different paths, you're going to constantly have to kind of have these dialogues, these engaged kind of interactive conversations with people to make sure people understand this. Now, this is just something that's not just a better way to make decisions. It's just not a better way to kind of roll out products and kind of have long-term relationships with your customers. But it's basically going to be the new norm. It's the way people are going to expect. It's like they're just not going to basically deal with these pronouncements coming from the center, they're going to actually always going to have a way to feel like they're interacting, to feel like they're giving feedback, to feel like they're kind of part of this process. Since the advent of broadcast television, television was the last huge impacting technology, immediate technology that basically changed the way we did everything. That came in about, let's say, 1960, and ever since 1960 in the United States and roughly in Europe and around the world, there's been one way of doing politics. And basically what you do is you had to get high net worth people or corporations that had a lot of money, get big money from people. You basically had, that's how you raise money. You had to then have control of the party, which is whatever political party you're a part of, you had to control it and be the insider in control, which is why you always had the insider vice president or the wife of the president or all these other ways that people would basically have access to controlling the party. And then the third thing is you basically had to master broadcast television, and particularly the 30-second ad. That was the old way you did politics. Whoever did that best always won. And until this last cycle. And that's with this new paradigm shift that Obama basically mastered, but there was a bunch of people around that, including myself. I was involved in that Obama. In fact, I was on his Technology and Media Advisory Committee, and I was involved with a lot of the Democrats who were trying to make that shift this last cycle, cycle being 2004 to 2008. Anyhow, the shift there, that new paradigm was, hey, you don't need just a few really wealthy people giving money. You could actually use these technologies to get up tons and tons and tons of little people to actually throw in little pieces that aggregate into more money, in fact, than the fat cats could get. That was a big breakthrough, and that was, and then in fact proved the case. Obama showed that he literally raised twice as much as John McCain and roughly twice as much as Hillary Clinton in this new method, and it was like, oh my God, that's a new paradigm, and that's what people are going to do. The second thing is you didn't need control of the party. You could be a total outsider like Obama was, young senator, no experience, very little experience. You could organize people outside the party, and those people using these new tools, these new ways of engagement, and in fact, you could in fact be more powerful and more effective than the people who controlled the party apparatus that had been the tried and true way for forever. And that was like a real breakthrough. It was like organizationally breakthrough. And then the third way is it said, hey, you don't need to just do these 30-second television ads. You can start to use web video. You can start to use social networking. You can do text messaging. You can do all these new media ways, right? And in fact, Obama did that and became a much more powerful way to connect to people, and broke through on that way too. So basically on all three of the fundamentals of politics, there was essentially a paradigm shift. Obama helped drive it, although was not the only person. And politics forever is going to be changed. In the United States, there isn't a candidate in the country now who's not studying that model extremely closely, and there will never be a presidential campaign that doesn't go that route from now on. Now that's a good kind of metaphor to how these tools, these new ways of engagement, this new media, absolutely and utterly transform politics in the space of 1 4-year cycle. It shows you how quickly these paradigm shifts can happen. And although I think the business world, in most traditional businesses, hasn't really been hit to the same dramatic kind of fashion yet, I would say that's the kind of way to be thinking in your industry or in your business, to be thinking, oh my God, the way we're doing business in this old paradigm, how is this going to be, what are the breakthroughs, what are the paradigm shifts that are going to happen because of these new tools, and how do we rethink the business in that new paradigm? Because that's essentially what is coming to an industry near you soon, which is like your business is going to be hit soon too. There's a concept in media now that's like, that instead of having a big hit, a blockbuster kind of film, or instead of having a big best-selling novel or something, that there's ways now that you can make money through smaller and smaller and smaller, aggregating crowds around, or audiences or customers around much smaller numbers. But over time, if you have many, 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 many of these smaller hits, you can actually make a lot of big money the same way that a big blockbuster hit movie or bestseller did. That is essentially the same phenomenon that's going on here, which is you don't need the big hit that everybody has to see or everyone has to buy that book. You can actually connect up all kinds of different people and aggregate little bits. And that is essentially, you're right, the long tail that we see in kind of the media business playing out very aggressively is essentially what came to politics this last cycle. the long tail of politics. And I think it's actually coming to a lot of different businesses. It just makes sense, is you can now aggregate up the little guys and little bits of money, little bits of consumers in these niche areas, and you can really make overarching a lot of good money that way. I do think the one piece that's the new frontier, I mean, there's always the next frontier. The next frontier in terms of the politics is getting elected. Electoral politics, the art of getting elected, went through this transformation using these new tools, these new network of approaches. But what, in terms of governing, once you're now elected, how do you govern in this new networked world? How do you apply these new tools to like making policies and figuring out the solutions to the big challenges of the country or whatever level of government you're in? I think that is just the new kind of, it's the new space that essentially is just starting a kind of wave of innovation. So I think my company, Next Agenda, in fact, is in that space. We're trying to figure out how to use these new tools and powerful new network approaches, not to winning in politics, that's been figured out, but essentially figuring out the next wave of big solutions to how does the country then solve these challenges. What are we going to do about climate change? How are we going to shift rapidly to new technologies? How are we going to solve, what's looming, some big water shortages and new crises that we haven't really wrapped our heads around how we're going to do it? We're trying to figure out a way that you use these new technologies to scale way, way, way more people into helping solve these problems, do it in a productive way. We think it's going to work in a kind of public policy setting. We also think ultimately if we crack the way to do that through physically gathering people and online using new collaborative tools, if we figure that out in a productive, efficient way, it's going to have implications for business as well, and we feel there's actually the ability to find ways to solve complex problems that no one knows how to solve. If you can use new tools, whether it's online tools or also face-to-face collaborative tools, if you integrate those two and do that in an efficient way in a short time frame of, let's say, 6 months to kind of wrap your head around a difficult problem and come out with some really powerful answers, that's a product that a lot of people are going to want to see. I think in 200 years from now, or 500 years from now, when people look back the way we look back on the Renaissance or the Enlightenment or something, they're going to say, gosh, what happened in the early 21st century was essentially the world went global. And it went global because it had the tools to do that, the interconnected kind of media connections, but it also had the new systems of thinking and how coordinating at a level. So what you're watching, you had a good, kind of mention, you said we went from the G8 to the G20. Well, the G20 is going to go to the G140 or whatever. I mean, it's like we're going to watch essentially new ways of governing, new ways of coordinating the global economy, new systems of regulating it at a global level. I mean, all that's just, if you look from the big picture of world history, we're essentially in the stage of watching that new system get born, that globally integrated system. One of the features of that system is going to be that it's not going to really matter. There's a globalization, interconnection of everything, but there's also this kind of, life still continues on cities, and city life is essentially the practical way that most people are going to experience living and their government. And in fact, you really want to get out there. Given the pressures of climate change, I think there's going to be a lot less ability to fly, at least in the short term, until we figure out new ways to kind of lower the carbon footprint of air transport. So I think there's going to be a lot more focus, essentially, on localization of systems. Probably localize more food production, much less kind of movement of, the idea now that, we're flying grapes from South America to markets in Europe and the United States, and bananas, and the whole, we're shipping things all over the world in this kind of crazy way. I mean, literally on a kind of a carbon footprint, climate change level, that's a bad system. And so in the next 20 to 50 years, as we rework the system, you're going to actually see a lot of interesting focus on the kind of local, the organized city kind of footprints, and then you're going to see this simultaneous interconnection globally. So here's a kind of a two-phase thing. Again, it gets all totally tied together and all made to work essentially is enabled essentially through these new technologies, which will allow us to be localized but still global, connected globally, working locally. It's going to work in a much different way. And so I think it's it's kind of the next political system will be, the one thing that's going to lose out is the national organization. And essentially you're going to squeeze, you're going to have a globally kind of organized world and a locally organized world, and these kind of artificial nation-state boundaries, which are essentially a very 20th century, well, let's say the last 200 years we were organized around that, but roughly the last 100 from a global sense was been national boundaries. Those things, I think, by mid-century are going to be kind of quaint. Climate change is going to be the meta challenge which is going to define all of our lives, and I think it's, you know, if you talk to public opinion polls in the United States and even Europe, it's still, in most average people don't think of it as the real defining feature of their lives. They have other pressing issues that they're more worried about. But I think if from a scientific point of view, and the more and more I get my head into this, the more clear it is essentially it is the one issue that will fundamentally require a complete reworking of basically everything, how we live, how the economy works, the energy systems we're based on, the footprints that we leave on the world, the way we grow agriculture. I mean, if you really think through what we have to do about climate change, it is a true transformation of the way we live and work, and it's going to be a real fundamentally different 21st century than 21st, and the main thing that's driving is climate change. I mean, at least we're all, you know, basically people now agree humans are changing the climate of the planet. If we change it much more, it is going to really be serious, like disasters on a unprecedented scale. And so whether we get moving now or in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, one thing's for sure, we're either going to deal with that or we're going to be in a disaster that's not worth even contemplating. And so once we basically kind of wrap our heads around that, which I think the global community is getting close to now, and in America I think it's starting to get much more serious, and I know the Europeans have been worried about Americans for a long time, but I think we finally got resolution around that. I think that is going to be the defining feature of our time, and I think it's going to have implications in every field. So yeah, I would say that is the mother of all challenges, and has implications through right down to almost every system we're working on. So the quicker you wrap your head around that as an individual or a business, the better you're off, because I can't see any way that that will not be an increasingly central problem to everybody's lives. It'll be the thing we're going to wake up every morning and think about.